Hi, we are here with Virginia Postrel, an author and columnist. Virginia, I would like to start off asking about the future and its enemies. If you could explain briefly what's the difference between dynamism and stasis.
Right. So The Future and Its Enemies, which came out 20 years ago, but is still relevant, is about understanding our political, social, cultural spectrum, not in the traditional left and right, but, as you say, between dynamism and stasis. And dynamism, which is what most of the book is about, is how does dynamism work, is about making progress not by having a plan, a central plan all worked out where you're working toward a certain goal that everybody has to march along together, but rather by having experimentation, feedback in a decentralized way. And that can be in markets with entrepreneurs and competition, or it could be in science with different hypotheses. And again, competition is very important. And the alternative, which I call stasis, is this ideal of the good society is a society that doesn't change. Either it's sort of backward looking, the good society was basically when everybody was a peasant and everybody knew their place and that was that. Or it can be, I'm for the future, I'm for progress, but it has to look exactly like this. And it exalts stability and control as opposed to learning, which is really the central value in a dynamic system, in dynamism.
In dynamism, you mentioned how the future is open-ended. Could you elaborate more on that?
Right. So this is the alternative. People tend to think if we talk about progress, it must be about like we're going toward a specific thing and then we'll eventually get there and then it will be utopia and that will be the end. But that's not really how we learn. It's not how we have human betterment. It's much more of an open-ended process. One thing leads to another. When you invent something, even if it's great, people start to say, hey, it could be better in this way or that way. And that could be anything from a recipe to a mobile phone to a university. It doesn't have to be a product. It could be an idea. But you need this sort of feedback, and so as a result, it's a never-ending sequence. It keeps going on, and you often hear people say, "Well, we have to have limits to growth. We have to limits to progress because we have a fixed amount of resources on planet Earth." And that's literally true. There's only so many atoms in the universe or whatever. But the real limit is how people can recombine things, whether that is resources, physical things, or whether it's ideas. And once you start to talk about combinations, the numbers get really big really fast. And so if you're talking about the amount of combinations on a digital device like a thumb drive or something, you're talking about numbers that dwarf the numbers of atoms in the universe or the numbers of seconds since the Big Bang. We're talking about one followed by billions and billions and billions of zeros. So the possibilities are enormous. And what we do as human beings is we come up with new ideas and we try them out and we see if other people like them, and sometimes they do and sometimes they don't, and then we find ways to improve. And a lot of progress is this very incremental kind of progress where people are trying new things and getting a little better. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes you have dramatic progress. You have people invent the internet, or they invent railroads, or they invent plastics, or invent penicillin and antibiotics. But a lot of times the progress is much more in small steps, but it accumulates to something really big.
And it seems that there's also an environment that fosters this kind of dynamism. Yeah. What is necessary for this environment?
So there are a number of things that are necessary. There are certain types of rules in society that make dynamism more possible. And they are things like respecting dispersed knowledge, respecting that human beings know a lot, collectively. Like if you take all the brains in the world, that's a lot of knowledge, but an individual knows very little compared to all the things there are to know. And so even the best, smartest person with the best, most powerful computer cannot plan everything in advance, cannot say. And so this is something that has become more and more apparent as we've gotten into the 21st century, but certainly in the 20th century, there was this idealization of central planning and the idea that you could make progress by prescribing a certain road. And so one thing is about allowing people to use their knowledge. Another thing is about allowing recombinations. Often, again, in the market, but could be in other institutions, you'll have regulations that are, it's not that they meant to prohibit a particular thing, it's just like whoever made the rule didn't think of it. So for example, one of my favorite examples is there are grape tomatoes, which are little, like cherry tomatoes, but they're oblong, like I forget what they call them, but the kind you use in cooking for pasta or salsa or whatever. And they became very popular. People developed them in the early 2000s, and suddenly they're everywhere, and they were delicious, and they were cute. But in the EU, they had regulations of tomatoes, and it wasn't that they wanted to ban these grape tomatoes, but their regulations had 4 kinds of tomatoes, and if they were little, they had to be round, and if they were oblong, they had to be of a certain size. And so there was this new combination didn't fit. And so that's sort of an example of you needing this environment that doesn't try to have these very, very detailed rules, but has much more general rules that allow people to do things like make commitments and give criticism and feedback and have competition, as opposed to this is how things are going to be. So that's sort of the rule, institutional, governmental aspect. And the other is really attitudes, a cultural, individual. It's things like accepting risk and accepting failure and learning from failure, as opposed to like, oh my God, I'm a loser, I can never do anything, but rather, get back up on that horse and try again. And what did you learn from this experience? And that is something we need to cultivate as individuals, but it's also something we need to cultivate as societies and cultures and learning environments or whatever it is, that we don't stigmatize people who try things and don't succeed the first time or don't succeed, that we admire them for trying.
Yeah. So it seems that in a lot of areas, there's a lot of innovation, trial and error, experimentation. Why do you think there's always resistance to change? And how can we cope, like looking into the future, how can we cope with that kind of mentality?
There are a few things. First of all, there are people who really, really value ideologically. They think the good society is the controlled society. And that's a lot of talk about that intellectual position in the future and its enemies. But I think more of the resistance is not ideological exactly. It's just individuals thinking, I'm afraid. I don't know what the future holds, and that makes me nervous. And so I want somebody to say they'll take care of it. They'll make sure it's good. And then the other aspect is anytime you can't have growth without change, whether it's in your individual life or whether it's in an economy or whatever. And change has downsides as well as upsides. So the long-term results are positive, but sometimes there's short-term pain. And when you're talking about economic change, that short-term pain often falls on a small group. And so there is this practical political issue of what happens if the general benefits are spread out and often longer term, and the specific costs are focused and maybe short term. And that creates a political dynamic where there's an instinct to stamp out the change.